Empathy is the ability to think about what someone else is going through. Empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another.
Empathy requires each one of us to stop thinking only of ourselves and to start thinking of others.
Every day, in every school, students are made fun of, outcasted, looked down upon, and made to feel worthless.
Respect people's feelings. Even if it doesn't mean anything to you, it could mean everything to them.
Empathy shows the people that are hurting that someone cares and that they are not alone.
Instead of putting others in their place, put yourself in their place.
Empathy is like a wildfire. A simple spark can ignite a chain reaction of compassion.
Empathy can change the world, starting with just one person, and that one person could be you.
What is empathy? Many people confuse empathy and sympathy. Empathy is not sympathy. Take a look at the top of the screen. We're going to look at 3 common English words that come from the Greek word pathos. The word pathos literally means suffering. And many times people will use this word to mean emotions. In English, we see this word written pathy as the second part of a compound word. It's usually preceded by one of the 3 prefixes. First, a, which means not. And when you make the compound word apathy, you have a word that means not suffering. Second, sim, which means with. And when you make the compound word sympathy, you have a word that means suffering, with or along with. You understand their suffering, but you're not suffering yourself. And thirdly, M, which means in or within. And when you make the compound word empathy, you have a word that means suffering within. Empathy is often described as the ability to feel what others are feeling as if you're feeling it within yourself. When another person suffers, you feel suffering within yourself as well. Let's look at some practical differences between these 3 words. Emotionally speaking, someone who has apathy or is apathetic has no emotion. They feel no suffering when someone else suffers or they have problems. Someone who is sympathetic will recall a similar emotion when someone suffers. And if you're someone who has empathy or is empathetic, you feel a deeply shared emotion as you attempt to understand and put yourself in the other person's place as they suffer. And one difference between sympathetic and empathetic people is that a sympathetic person acknowledges that a person is suffering. If they want to help, they'll usually try to make things better by cheering the person up, while an empathetic person will listen and try to understand the emotion rather than simply make the person feel better. Similarly, apathetic people have a lack of feeling toward other people. Sympathetic people will recall similar feelings when someone suffers, and empathetic people, otherwise known as empaths, will share the feelings of another person and feel the same emotions as the person who is suffering. Consequently, an apathetic person is indifferent to another person's suffering or problems. A sympathetic person will have concern for another person, and an empathetic person will try to fully understand why another person is suffering and feel the anxiety the person's feeling. And as you may have already deduced, an apathetic person has no interest in the sufferings or the problems of another person. A sympathetic person is interested in the welfare of another person and wants the other person to feel better. And an empathetic person is emotionally involved when another person has problems or is suffering. And these people listen intently to the other person's problems and cry along with the sufferer. While sympathy is a caring feeling and shows kindness toward another, empathy creates an emotional bond that is very deep and can help the sufferer in ways that sympathy just cannot. Empathy is actually putting yourself in another's place. Empathy is imagining what another person is feeling and trying to understand what they're going through. When you experience empathy, you understand and feel another person's emotions. Remember, each of our lessons are based on Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And we are learning how to overcome evil with good in our relationships in 7 steps that we find in Romans 12:14 through 21. And step 1 was manage your mouth, bless and not curse. And that was based on Romans 12:14, which says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Today, we'll look at step number 2, which is put yourself in the other's place and try to understand their feelings, their thoughts, and their position. And our lesson today is based on Romans 12:15 and 16, which reads, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. That's Romans 12:15 and 16. These 2 verses teach us further how to deal with bad relationships. Our Bible text today is not that different from the old Native American proverb that says, to understand a man, you must walk a mile in his moccasins. Paul has already explained that if you have a bad relationship, first of all, manage your mouth. Secondly, as we'll see in this lesson, he tells us we have to try to see things from the other person's point of view. Look, I get it. If someone has wronged you, it's wrong. But there may be some reasons behind it that make it more understandable. And if you can understand those reasons, you might not be so hot under the collar. Plus, you may even be able to help the other person and heal the relationship. We don't know why some people do the things that they do. We may think we know, but let's face it, we just can't know what another person's thinking unless that person tells us. And 1 Corinthians 2:11 says that. It echoes that whole thought. It says, for who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? Only you know your thoughts, and that's true of every other person on earth. Stephen Covey, in his national bestseller, tells people how to make positive changes in their personal lives. He calls it the 7 habits of highly effective people. Habit number 5 is seek first to understand, then to be understood. So do you see where the focus is? The focus is on the other person. Highly effective people, Covey says, seek to understand the other person. And the problem with many relationships is that one or both of the people are focusing on themselves. They're thinking things like, what about me? How will this affect me? What do I get out of this? When we focus on the other person, we can begin to better understand their position. The Apostle Paul teaches us to use the same empathetic principle by telling us to understand a person from 3 different aspects. Understanding their emotion, understanding their thinking, and understanding their position. First, understand their emotion. Paul writes, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn, Romans 12:15. Have you noticed that most of the times you're hurt, it's an emotional time? Either you're emotional and especially sensitive, or the person who hurts you is emotional and especially insensitive, or both. Instead of focusing on your own emotions when you're interacting with someone you can't stand, try something different. If you want to have a better relationship, as the old proverb says, take a walk in their moccasins and see how they feel. How's this other person feeling? Try not to simply judge their behavior. Think about this. We usually judge others by their behavior without considering their intentions. But we judge ourselves by our intentions, and so we justify our behavior. And I think we do this because we usually think we know the other person's intention when really we have no idea. We often assume that the person who wronged us for an evil reason, when we really have no earthly idea why they said or did what bothers us. If they've wronged us or said something wrong, it's usually not a question of whether or not it was wrong, but the question is, or should be, why did they do it? What were the feelings that prompted their actions? We should try to share those emotions. How do you do that, you might ask? Well, there's only one way that I know of, and that's ask. You may find that a person is angry about something, or maybe even is in grief. Do you think that'll influence their behavior? In the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People book, Stephen Covey tells the story of getting on a subway in New York City with a man and his kids. Children were screaming, they were throwing things, and disturbing everyone around them. What did the father do? He simply sat there and did nothing. Covey was thinking what a lousy parent this man was. He had no control over his kids. He had no sensitivity for the other passengers. Thinking that he would do something about it, Covey goes to the man and tells him how his children are misbehaving. The man responded apologetically and says he didn't even notice. He had just come from the hospital where his wife had died. The fact was, he was so overwhelmed that he was oblivious to what was happening on the subway. It's a lot easier to understand this man's behavior when you get into his shoes, isn't it? It would be a little bit easier to have a relationship with him since you now feel his pain. I read of a man who had a friend that used to drive him nuts because he talked so much about himself and always tried to position himself at the limelight in church. Gradually, he began avoiding this man and began to dislike him. This went on until one day when he actually listened to his story. He found out that the man was an orphan and had been passed around a lot. He was really insecure about relationships and typically ended up going overboard in personal encounters so that he could get people's acceptance. The author wrote that it was much easier to have a relationship with him when he understood and felt his insecurity. Now, Paul is telling us here in Romans 12 to have good relationships, and to do so means that we need to share the highs and lows of people's lives. We must try to capture their feelings. Remember today's text. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and mourn with those who mourn. Romans 12:15. And not just with the people we like. If we expect to be able to do this, we have to have empathy. Jesus showed us empathy. Don't we want to follow in Jesus' footsteps? Have you ever noticed how often Jesus was at weddings and funerals in the Gospels? Could it be that he wanted to be with people at the times they were experiencing their greatest emotional highs and lows? These are important times in people's lives. That's why people nearly always remember those who attended the funerals of their loved ones. Jesus knew these were vulnerable times and it was important to have empathy. Luke tells us, for example, that Jesus had compassion at a funeral in the town of Nain, and so he raised the widow's son from the dead. He also wept at Lazarus' tomb, even though he knew Lazarus would be raised. John tells us that after talking to Mary, the sister of Lazarus, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. That's John 11:33. Now that is empathy. Paul, too, knew that having empathy was something important, so much so that he makes it the trait of a Christian. You may be wondering at this point, well, how do I empathize with people I don't like? Look, we often have trouble empathizing with other people's emotions, even people we care about. Sometimes it's hard to understand what a person's going through if you don't have any experience and you haven't undergone that for yourself, or at least felt similar things. This idea takes effort. We have to sometimes fight against the feelings that seem to come naturally. For example, if someone you don't like is really happy and rejoicing, do you ever get jealous? A good example of this is in Luke 15, where we find the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. First of all, there's a lost sheep. After the shepherd finds it, he gets with all his friends and they're delighted. That's the appropriate emotion for the moment. Next, a woman loses her coin. After searching and searching, it's finally recovered. With great joy coming from the moment, she throws a party. Their emotions match the moment. In the final story, a son is lost. Eventually, the prodigal son returns. The father puts on a feast. They eat the prized calf. Everyone is happy. It's the proper emotion of the moment. Then all of a sudden, in this parable, something is wrong. The older brother appears and he sulks rather than rejoices. He doesn't share happy emotion of the moment. This is a big problem with relationships that go sour. We tend not to share the proper emotions of the moment. If everything is going wonderful for someone who has wronged us, we don't rejoice, but we feel jealous or resentful. We wish grief on them, or we're not happy for their good fortune. And if everything is bad and falling apart in their life, are we glad? Or do we feel they deserve the misfortune for what they did to us? Where is our focus? In overcoming a bad relationship, we need to say good things, as we saw in our last lesson, but we must also try to share their feelings. Otherwise, how can we say we rejoice with those who rejoice, or we mourn with those who mourn? Paul continues this teaching on empathy by telling us that we have to try to understand the other person's thinking. He writes, "Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion." That's Romans 12:16. Do you know someone who's always demanding in their relationships? Do you know someone who constantly is fishing for compliments to the point of belittling themselves? They think they're unattractive and unpopular, and they're not. If you knew about the struggles they faced growing up, you might learn to understand. To develop a better relationship with someone you can't stand, you have to try to see things as they see them. They may not think like you, but understanding how and why they see the situation is important if we're truly interested in reconciliation. And anytime we get into an argument with someone, we must look for a way to resolve the conflict. This is often very difficult because in an argument we want people to understand our side. But they too have a side, and they too have a reason for being on that side. And that's why Stephen Covey's fifth habit is seek first to understand, then to be understood. The third thing Paul teaches is that we have to try to understand the other person's position. Again, he says, "Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion." Being humble, as Paul commands, involves putting other people above us. But isn't history full of people putting other people down? Let's face it, we all have a tendency to position people below us. Just as in Paul's time, there are, and there always will be, a group of people who are looked down upon. It can happen because of race, economic status, social position, academic background, rank at work, or 1,000 other reasons. It's pretty easy to laugh about someone who doesn't dress as nicely as you, is not as tall as you, not as smart as you, not as coordinated as you, when you see that person as someone beneath you. God commands us to put all other people above us. So, when encountering people who we might see as lower than us, even if their words or actions are wrong, try to realize what it's like to be in the position that they're in, or try to realize what it's like to have the problems that they may have. Try to imagine surviving with no money and few prospects for a job. Try to grasp what it's like to grow up without a father's influence. Try to see things from their perspective, and there'll be some prospect for healing. Consider what I'm about to say, and then think about whether this statement's true in your life. In bad relationships, we nearly always take the position of looking down on the other person. We act as if we're better, smarter, holier than they are. Another way I've heard that is, our dirt's not as dirty as their dirt. But that may just be because we don't understand their position. We know what life is like where we live. However, we rarely make an honest effort to analyze what it's like to be in another position in life. If we did, maybe we'd recognize the motivation behind why they think or act differently than we do. It may not immediately or completely resolve the problem, but at least the conflict will make a little more sense, and that's a good place to start. Remember, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:21. There's a lot of evil that needs to be overcome. What do we do about it? Where do we start? Well, step one, we manage our mouths. Bless and don't curse. And step two, we put ourselves in the other person's place and try to understand their feelings, thoughts, and position. And next week, we'll see step three, Romans 12:17, and we will learn to never, never, never take revenge. If you weren't sure of what empathy was at the start of this lesson, go back and re-watch the opening video clip. And until next week, think about people with whom you're in conflict. Put empathy into practice. Make a positive change in a relationship. And, as Sally says, be sweet.